It's the middle of the night. You're somewhere deep in enemy territory, a forest in Germania, a hillside in Gaul, the edge of a desert in the east. The sun went down hours ago. You are exhausted. Your legs are destroyed from marching 20 miles today under nearly 40 kilograms of gear. Every muscle in your body is begging you to lie down and close your eyes. And you can't, because you're on watch. You're standing guard at the edge of the camp, staring into a darkness that could be hiding nothing at all, or could be hiding an entire enemy warband waiting for exactly this moment. And here's the part that makes your blood run cold. If you fall asleep right now, the enemy isn't the thing most likely to kill you. Your own friends are. Because in the Roman army, a soldier who fell asleep on watch faced one of the most horrifying punishments ever devised. He would be beaten to death. Not by the enemy, not by an executioner, but by the very men he was supposed to be protecting. The men in his own tent. The men he ate with, marched with, bled with. They would form two lines, and they would club and stone him to death, together, as a lesson to everyone else. So the question, how did Romans sleep at war, turns out to be far darker and far more fascinating than it sounds. Because sleeping in a Roman army on campaign wasn't just about rest. It was about survival, engineering, paranoia, iron discipline, in a system so ruthless and so brilliant that it conquered most of the known world. Let's get into it. Let's start with something that will completely change how you picture a Roman army on the march. When we imagine ancient soldiers stopping for the night, we tend to picture them just stopping, throwing down a bedroll wherever they happen to be, lighting a fire, collapsing under the stars, maybe posting a guard or two. That's how most ancient armies did it, and it's how most armies throughout history did it. The Romans did something almost unbelievable by comparison. Every single night, when a Roman army on campaign stopped to rest in hostile territory, they did not just lie down. They built a fort. Not a camp, a fort. A fortified, defensible, walled military installation, complete with a ditch, an earthen rampart, a wooden palisade of sharpened stakes, gates, guard positions, and a precise internal street grid. And then they tore it all down the next morning, marched another 20 miles, and built the entire thing again from scratch. Every single night. Think about the sheer insanity of that discipline. You've just marched all day carrying a crushing load. You are bone tired. And before you're allowed to rest, before you can eat, before you can do anything, you have to dig a defensive ditch, pile up a wall of earth, hammer in a palisade of stakes, and lay out an entire camp. The ancient historian Polybius, a Greek who studied the Roman military in detail, described all of this with something close to amazement. He could hardly believe how efficiently the Romans organized this nightly labor. And they were fast. A Roman legion could build one of these fortified marching camps in somewhere between 2 and 6 hours, depending on the terrain and the danger. They were so practiced at it that, as one description put it, after a few months of campaigning, legionaries could set up the entire camp practically with their eyes closed. The layout never changed. The same grid, the same streets, the same positions, night after night, year after year, for centuries. It was a city you could build and unbuild on demand. So why on earth would an exhausted army go to all that trouble just to sleep for one night? Because the Romans understood something that most ancient commanders never fully grasped. The most dangerous moment for any army is when it's resting. A sleeping army is a vulnerable army. A surprise night attack on an unprepared, scattered force could turn a powerful legion into a panicked slaughter in minutes. Men stumbling in the dark, no idea where the enemy is, no defensive line, no organization. That's how armies got annihilated. The marching camp solved this completely. Behind that ditch and rampart, the Roman soldier could actually sleep because he knew that even if the enemy attacked in the dead of night, they'd have to cross a ditch, climb a wall, and break through a palisade, all while Roman sentries raised the alarm and the legion formed up behind its defenses. The camp turned a vulnerable resting army into a fortress that just happened to be temporary. This is the genius hiding inside the question of how Romans slept. They didn't just find better ways to sleep, they engineered safety itself. They built a wall between themselves and death every single night, so that sleep, that most defenseless of human states, became survivable, even in the heart of enemy land. The fortification wasn't separate from how they slept, it was how they slept. Now let's go inside the camp, because the way it was organized tells you everything about Roman thinking. The camp was laid out like a small city, and not by accident. Two main roads crossed it at right angles, the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria, dividing the whole space into neat quadrants, exactly like a planned town. Polybius described the Roman camp as a near-perfect rectangle, with streets laid out so cleanly that soldiers from different units never had to shove past each other or collide. Each cohort had its own street. Everyone knew exactly where they belonged. In the center stood the commander's tent, the praetorium, along with the tents for the standards, the sacred symbols of the legion, and the administrative areas. Around them, in their assigned rows, were the tents of the ordinary soldiers. And here is where we get to the actual sleeping arrangements, which were a lot less comfortable than the brilliant engineering around them. The ordinary legionary slept in a leather tent shared with 7 other men. This unit, 8 men sharing a tent, was called a contubernium, which literally means those who share a tent. It was the smallest unit in the entire Roman army, the squad-level bond at the very foundation of the legion. These 8 men cooked together, ate together, fought together, and slept crammed together in a single tent of stretched leather, originally animal hide, later sometimes canvas. These tents were carried on the backs of mules as the army marched, then pitched in their assigned rows each evening. 8 grown men, in armor's worth of exhaustion, packed into a leather tent on the hard ground. It was not luxurious. Ancient sources are honest about this. Sleeping conditions in a Roman camp were often genuinely uncomfortable, and bad weather could make camp life miserable. Rain turned the ground to mud. Cold seeped through the leather. And yet, even with all that, the Roman camp still offered a dramatically better and safer night's rest than almost any other army of the era could manage. That contubernium of 8, by the way, wasn't just a sleeping arrangement. It was the social glue of the legion. These were the men whose lives were most directly in your hands, and yours in theirs. Which makes the punishment we started with even more chilling. Because if you fell asleep on watch, it was often these very men, your tent brothers, who would be required to kill you. Let's talk about the nights themselves, because the Romans divided the darkness with the same obsessive precision they applied to everything else. The night was split into 4 watches, called vigiliae. The first watch, the prima, ran roughly from 6 in the evening to 9. The second, the secunda, from 9 to midnight. The third, the tertia, from midnight to 3 in the morning. And the fourth, the quarta, from 3 until 6, when dawn arrived. 4 shifts, rotating, so that throughout the entire night, fresh men were always awake and watching, while the rest of the army slept. Guards were posted at the gates, along the rampart, and at observation points around the camp. To move around the camp at night, or to enter it, you needed a password, a watchword called the tessera, written on a small tablet and distributed through the ranks each evening. A sentry would challenge anyone approaching, and the wrong answer marked you instantly as an intruder. It was a security system 2,000 years ahead of its time. Rotating shifts, fixed posts, and a nightly changing password. And the Romans took the integrity of this system so seriously that they built an inspection process on top of it. Officers made rounds during the night to check that the sentries were awake and at their posts. The watchmen carried the tessera tablets, and the rounds were designed specifically to catch any guard who had abandoned his position, or, the unforgivable sin, fallen asleep. Which brings us back to the horror we opened with. What actually happened to a Roman soldier caught sleeping on watch? The punishment was called the fustuarium, and it is one of the most brutal disciplinary practices in military history. Here's how it worked, as described by Polybius himself. If a sentry was found to have fallen asleep on night watch or deserted his post, he was brought before a military tribunal. If found guilty, the tribune would take a cudgel and simply touch the condemned man with it. That light touch was a death sentence, because at that signal, the soldiers of the camp, his own comrades, would set upon him with clubs and stones and beat him to death, right there in front of the assembled army.
Let that sink in. Not executed by an officer, not killed by a professional executioner, beaten to death by the men he served alongside, the men he shared a tent with. The logic was as cold as it was effective. A man who fell asleep on watch had endangered the lives of everyone in that camp, so everyone in that camp would take part in his death. It made the punishment a collective act, and it made the lesson impossible to ignore. And here's the truly dark detail. Even if a condemned man somehow survived the beating and escaped, his life was effectively over anyway. He couldn't return home. He was barred from his own city, and no member of his family would dare take him in. He became a ghost, alive perhaps, but erased from the world he'd come from. Polybius, observing all this, drew the obvious conclusion. He wrote that precisely because the penalty was so severe and so unavoidable, the night watches of the Roman army were kept with absolute, scrupulous discipline. Nobody slept on watch. Nobody. The fear of the fustuarium was so total that it simply did not happen. The Romans had, in the most brutal way imaginable, solved the eternal military problem of the sleepy sentry. They made falling asleep more terrifying than any enemy in the dark. It's worth pausing here to understand why the Romans were willing to be this ruthless, because it reveals something deep about how their whole war machine worked. The Roman army did not run on courage. That sounds strange, but it's essentially what the sources tell us. The Romans didn't trust courage alone to keep men at their posts. Courage is unreliable. It comes and goes. A man can be brave one night and terrified the next. Julius Caesar understood this. Polybius understood this. So instead of relying on bravery, the Romans built a system where the consequences of failure were so horrifying, so certain, that discipline became more reliable than fear of the enemy. A Roman soldier on watch was trapped between two terrors, the unknown enemy in the darkness and the absolutely known fate waiting for him if he closed his eyes. And the genius, the cold, brutal genius, was that the punishment was worse than the threat. The thing in the dark might not come. The fustuarium absolutely would. So you stayed awake. This is the real answer to how Romans slept at war. The army as a whole could sleep soundly behind its walls precisely because a few men, every night, were kept awake by a fear deeper than exhaustion. The comfort of the many rested on the discipline of the few, and that discipline was enforced with a savagery that we can barely comprehend today. Now let's talk about the other end of the experience, what it was actually like, physically, to sleep as a Roman soldier on campaign. Because the engineering brilliance doesn't change the fact that it was hard. Picture the daily rhythm. You march all day, often 15 to 20 miles, sometimes more, under enormous weight. Weapons, armor, tools, rations, stakes for the palisade, sometimes totaling 30 to 40 kilograms. When the army finally halts, there's no rest yet. First comes the labor, digging, building, hammering, hauling. Only once the camp is secure do you get to eat and finally lie down in that crowded leather tent with 7 other men. And your night might be cut into pieces. If your contubernium drew a watch, some of you would be roused in the cold and dark to stand guard for 3 hours before stumbling back to sleep. There was no concept of 8 uninterrupted hours. Your rest was fragmented, conditional, and always subject to the alarm that could come at any moment. In summer, the leather tents were stifling and cramped. In winter campaigns, the army often built more permanent quarters, wooden barracks or huts instead of tents, insulated against the cold with hides and straw, because leather alone could not keep men alive through a northern winter. The Romans knew that a frozen, sleep-deprived soldier was a useless soldier, So the winter camps, the castra hiberna, were genuine upgrades in comfort, with proper buildings, watchtowers, and gates. But on the march, in the summer campaigning season, it was the leather tent, the hard ground, the 8 bodies, and the broken sleep. The greatest army in the ancient world ran on exhausted men, grabbing whatever rest they could behind walls they'd built that very afternoon. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely astonishes, it worked better than anyone else's system on Earth. While other armies scattered to sleep and prayed they wouldn't be attacked, the Romans turned every single night into a controlled, fortified, guarded operation. While other armies lost men to surprise night raids, the Romans made the night raid almost pointless. Why attack men behind a wall who are organized, alert, and ready to form up in seconds? While other armies relied on the personal courage of individual soldiers, the Romans engineered courage out of the equation and replaced it with a machine of discipline that ran the same way every night for centuries. This is why those marching camps mattered so much. Some of them were used for a single night and then abandoned, but the discipline behind them was a weapon as powerful as any sword. An army that can rest safely, anywhere, in the middle of enemy territory is an army that can go anywhere and stay there. The ability to sleep securely in hostile land is, quietly, one of the foundations on which the entire Roman Empire was built. In fact, the legacy outlived the army itself. Because these camps followed the same rigid grid every time, many of them, when they became permanent, grew into towns and then cities. Across Europe today, there are cities whose street plans still echo the layout of a Roman military camp. The Via Principalis and Via Praetoria, preserved in modern roads. People walk to work every morning along streets first laid out by exhausted legionaries deciding where to pitch their tents for the night. The word camp itself comes from the Latin campus. The places where Romans slept at war became the places where millions of people now live their entire lives. So let's go back to where we started. You're on watch, deep in enemy territory, exhausted beyond words, fighting to keep your eyes open against the crushing pull of sleep. Now you understand what's really holding the whole thing together. Behind you, your comrades sleep, not because the night is safe, but because they built it safe this afternoon, with their own hands, ditch and wall and stake. And you stay awake, not because you're braver than they are, but because the system around you has made staying awake the only survivable choice. The wall keeps the enemy out. The fear keeps you alert. And together, those two things let the most powerful army in history close its eyes in the heart of hostile land and live to march again at dawn. The Romans didn't conquer the world only on battlefields. They conquered it in the dark, every night, one fortified camp at a time, by solving the simplest and most dangerous problem any army ever faces. How do you sleep when everything out there wants you dead? The Roman answer was to build a wall, post a guard, and make sure that guard was more afraid of falling asleep than of anything waiting in the night. Brutal, cold, and, astonishingly, world-changingly effective.